Hello, No Fear podcast listeners. We have been doing a robot centric episode series, and we have had a lot of fun with this topic. And unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. So, this will be our last episode on robots. And I guess that really leaves us with one thing to say, and that's these violent delights have violent ends. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is a No Fear cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 2, episode 16, our fourth, and as Lisa mentioned at the top of the episode, last episode in our Robots and Androids series. So if you haven't already listened to the other robot episodes, you might want to listen to them first, but you don't have to in order to follow our conversation in this one. Now, this episode is actually a continuation of our last episode. In our last episode, we had so many good and bad robots to talk about in TV and movies that we decided to cut ourselves off. I think the episode was actually a little bit shorter than other ones, but we just didn't want to get so far ahead of ourselves that we wouldn't be able to give proper time to all our bad and some good robots. So, Lisa, I think I'm going to pass it to you because the quote that you read there at the beginning is from Westworld, right? So you want to tell us a little bit about Westworld and what it does with robots?
Yes, it is from Westworld. Originally, it's a reference to William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. I think it's spoken by Friar Lawrence in the play. And it's, if you haven't seen Westworld, I want to first go ahead and encourage everyone out there to go find it and watch it. It's about to start its second season, I think the end of this month. That would be the end of April. And the first season was just, it was phenomenal. It did everything I wanted it to do. And so because I know Matt and Mel, I don't think you guys have seen it yet. And probably a lot of our listeners have not seen it. I'm going to avoid a lot of spoilers and just kind of give you the very basics. That line I read kind of gives you a clue, I think, as to what's happening in this Westworld universe. And it's a line of, I guess you could say, poetry or a line from Shakespeare that's almost kind of literally and figuratively floating around Westworld. And it's not quite shown until closer to the end, actually, what it means. So I won't go into too much detail. But let me tell you guys a little bit about Westworld just to give you a bit of background. And don't worry, I am avoiding spoilers. This is the 2016 HBO series that is based upon Michael Crichton's book that came out, I think, in the 70s. And I haven't read the book, but from summaries I've read of the book and from excerpts I've read of the book, I think, reads more like a Jurassic Park, just with the Wild West and robots instead of dinosaurs on a tropical island. But it's the same kind of concept of humans have created this theme park. And really what comes into question is like corporate greed and how far we will push the limits of entertainment and what we will call entertainment just to pull a profit, I guess. What the HBO series does, I think, is so much more interesting and it's so much more nuanced. But basically the premise is there's a theme park for the ultra wealthy, and it is inhabited by these robots, these androids, who are programmed to give the people who go to the theme park like a real Wild West experience. And so they are programmed with storylines. And so you can go, if you want to say, go on a hunt for a buried treasure, you could do that with some of these robots. You just kind of have to find the right one. Or if you want to go have a shootout in a saloon with somebody, you could do that. And it's all it's really interesting to see the way they build the theme park, because, obviously the robots are built so that they can die, and they can have horrible things happen to them, but they can never harm somebody who's a human. And the humans are equipped with like real weapons, but the weapons are enhanced in such a way that they can't harm the other humans either. So it's supposed to be a very protected environment. But what ends up happening, as you can imagine, it becomes a place where people can enact their darkest desires, basically. And so you have women robots who are there almost solely for men to like run down and capture and kidnap and rape. Or, there are robots there that their sole purpose is to be murdered and then, kind of rebooted, and they play the storyline again. And so what really ends up, and again, I'm not giving away any spoilers because this is all probably the first 10 minutes of the first episode that this gets established. It really aligns well with, I think, what we've been talking about with our robot series and where we've kind of been leading with this. And that's the idea that I think what we fear in robots is really what we fear about ourselves. Like asking these questions of why did we create robots in the first place? And we talked about this in the last episode, but like the idea of creating robots solely almost to be a slave race to us. And then just questioning the idea of why do we expect an inevitable robot uprising? Well, it's because we've done horrible things to them. And Westworld, if you're at all interested in that sort of like thematic structure, Westworld really kind of struggles with that. I mean, it does a bit, of course, like you would expect with a robot story to, deal with ethics and morality and, self-awareness versus artificial intelligence and what's programmed and what's not. But really at the core of each episode, I think, is forcing us to look at ourselves as humans and question what we would do to something that we created, if that makes sense at all. And anyway, that just really seemed to tie in well with everything we've talked about up to this point in our own episode series. I don't know. Did I sell you guys on it at all?
Oh, I was thinking while you were talking, it reminded me a lot of Bradbury's Marionettes.
Yes.
Creating people so that you could murder them and or have sex with them or let them replace you in your life so you could do other things. So it's like just everything we talked about with the idea of like, okay, so you've created a robot, another thing, and then how far are you going to go with the robot? And also, I mean, what does it say about us as human beings that, oh, it's like, well, I'm not murdering a human. I'm just murdering someone who looks just like this person. I mean, talk about weird kind of fantasy stuff. It's like, it's all okay now because we'll just do it to this robot, whatever you can think of, whatever twisted thing, and it's, I don't know, it's disturbing, especially if it's robots that look very realistic. I mean, what does that really mean about us, or what does that really say about us? Yeah.
Exactly. And that was another thing that, and not even kind of bringing it outside of Westworld, since I don't want to talk too much about it, because there are some wonderful plot twists that you guys just have to watch the first season. It's wonderful. But yeah, it's kind of one of those things that I was thinking about as we've been talking is, we talked a lot about the uncanny valley at the beginning of this whole episode series and how the closer a robot looks to becoming human, the more we kind of push it away. But at the same time, I started to ask myself, well, why are we creating these robots to look human? Especially if we're going to enslave them, or as Bradbury suggested, that we're going to do more nefarious things to them. Why do we need them to look so human? If if something is there for me to enact this kind of crazy dark role play, why can't I make it look less human and still get the same fulfillment out of it? Because that starts to bring up some really uncomfortable places of like ethics and morality that I think most people don't want to think about.
Well, I mean, a robot that doesn't look like a person wouldn't necessarily fulfill a fantasy, right? I mean, if you're trying to recreate a fantasy or provide yourself someone to abuse or torture, you're going to want the object of that to look like your, I don't know what to say, real life or human object, right? You know, I'm just thinking like if it's a sexual fantasy, for instance, you're not going to want like one of these little robots that can barely make it up the stairs and have like the bulbous round head, you know? Like you're going to want that robot that looks like the person that you want as your partner or as your victim, depending upon how, you know, violent the fantasy is. I don't know. Maybe I just have a really dark mind with this, but.
Well, that does kind of illustrate that maybe, you know, we need to be a little bit more pessimistic when we're looking at our future, because I would think, you know, when we talk, because we have talked about the idea of robots being like a sign of like an optimistic future where we have technology that can help us in this ever-growing technology, and it seems like we have a bright future. But if that were the case, as you kind of alluded to, Mel, then we would have robots that don't look like humans. You know, kind of like right now, the robotic vacuums just look like these big round discs, because we don't want them to look like Rosie from the Jetsons running around our house. You know, we want it to look like a machine. But the fact that we're creating robots that look more and more human, that makes me question why they need to look human. And if Bradbury teaches us anything, as you so astutely pointed out, then maybe we need them to look human because they're going to be a stand-in for what we want to do to other humans. And something tells me that's not going to be pretty.
Yeah, I mean, we already have robots in some ways fighting wars for us. I can totally see in the future having some sort of more humanoid robot as even a soldier, you know. I know in the mini episode we talked about that horrible, horrible movie, Not Quite Human, but that was what the evil guy wanted to do, right? He's like, oh, look, we have this robot that looks like a person. Let's make it fight a war for us. Like, let's make it do all these things that we don't want to do as humans, as people. And yeah, it's just kind of like copying and repeating the same horrible tropes of what humans have done to each other all these years. It's just like, oh, now we'll just make humans to treat them horribly. I just find that so disturbing. It's very human, but it's very disturbing.
Well, you know, I keep thinking, and Matt, I think this is where you're going to have to jump in because you got me hooked on another obsession. You know, of course, I'm hoping to really get y'all hooked on Westworld, and I'm hoping by the next time we record this podcast, you'll both be just gushing about the show because I need to talk to somebody about it, especially leading up into season 2. But Matt, you have been talking up Battlestar, and I finally sat down and watched a few episodes, and I haven't watched enough where I think I can speak with any certainty on the Cylons, but they do something interesting, especially with the idea of being able to look human.
Yeah, the Cylons from Battlestar Galactica, and I guess I should say that we're talking here specifically about the reboot from the early 2000s, not the original show from the very late 70s, early 80s. The Cylons in the new Battlestar Galactica, like you said, Lisa, they do this interesting thing where some of them look like robotic cyber android type things, like sort of these drone things, but the ones that have the most interactions with humanity are ones that look indistinguishable from humans. And I know that the show has actually been ended for quite some time, probably almost 10 years now, but since you just started watching it, Lisa, I'm not going to give too many spoilers about the end away, but they do some, like you said, really interesting stuff with these Cylons that look human. And in fact, some of these Cylons that look human don't even know that they are Cylons. They are programmed to believe that they're human. And it's this really interesting parallel between what was going on in the world at the time, which was the Iraq War and fears of terrorist sleeper cells and all these sorts of things that were happening. And they parallel so perfectly into this future with Battlestar Galactica, where you've got these literal sleeper agents that don't even know that they are programmed to, at some point, cause all kinds of problems for humanity. And Lisa, how far have you gotten? Are you at the end of the first season yet, or?
Nope.
Okay.
Not yet.
Let's just say then, because, excuse me, because I don't want to spoil any of the good surprises, but let's just say that there is one that's aboard the Battlestar Galactica, and I guess actually we should probably back up for those of you who've never seen Battlestar Galactica. It's it chronicles this sort of robot uprising. Like it begins like the miniseries that was sort of the pilot for the show says that there was this war with these Cylons that humanity had created. Then they just basically packed up and left for 30 years, and nobody had heard from them. And then they come back and basically nuke all the planets that have humans on them. And so that's a very small group of survivors on a fleet of ships, like fleeing through space, uncharted space, as the Cylons chase them. And they do some, like I said, really brilliant stuff with this idea of sleeper agents, where there is a Cylon aboard the main ship in the fleet, the Battlestar Galactica, who is one of the crewmen. And you as the viewer know that she's a Cylon, and it's almost like waiting for the shoe to drop. What's going to happen when the programming kicks in? And yeah, it's really good. It's really good.
So the robots don't know they're robots then?
Most of them do.
They're just going about their life? Or
most of the robots know that they are robots and know exactly what they're doing, but there are very few that have been put into strategic positions that are unaware of what they are.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a really, really, really good show, and I've been harping on it for years. As you said, Lisa, it's one of my favorite things, one of my favorite sci-fi shows for sure. But yeah, they definitely, they do, like I said, they do some really interesting stuff with making parallels between our world and this sci-fi futuristic world. And I don't know, I feel like I'm dancing around a lot of stuff because I don't want to ruin too much for you, but suffice to say, it's definitely interesting to see these robots as villains, but then they also are given a very sympathetic light too. So it's not like just a pure humans versus robots either. There is, especially as the show goes on, points of sympathy for the Cylons as well.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because I think that is the one thing, if you could pinpoint what we fear, is not knowing who the robots are. And that's where that uncanny valley really kicks in. But that's a perfect example of we feel comfort in being able to place people into categories and to think we understand their motivations. And I think that's a fear of a robot that looks so human you can't tell us apart, or perhaps even that they could be programmed not to know what they are until something is activated. That's terrifying.
Well, it's only terrifying if they have bad intentions, right? I mean, if they have good intentions, what's so scary about that?
But I think we've established that they have bad. They all have bad intentions. That's the way every one of these science fiction movies ends, right?
Well, even if they have good intentions, if you thought they were human the whole time and then you find out they're a robot, there's going to be I think as a human, there's going to be a bit of like a creepy, uncanny feeling in that. And maybe even a knee-jerk reaction against it. I'm not sure. It would depend on the person, I guess.
Oh, I'm not saying you're wrong, Mel. I agree that if one of you revealed that, yes, I've actually been a robot all this time, I would definitely be creeped out, but I don't think I'd have I wouldn't be afraid, because neither one of you has shown anything but good intentions towards the rest of us. So it would definitely be weird, but I mean, I wouldn't be terrified of you or something. But then if, your arm opened up and turned into like a cannon and started shooting things, that would be scary. So
But I could also pull an electric grandmother and pour hot cocoa out of my finger.
I don't know. That might be scary. Maybe if it was coffee, then I might be okay with that.
And that's kind of what that is kind of what we're seeing with the few robotic inventions that have moved into our home, is we are completely willing to accept them when they make our lives easier. When they give us what they want and we know what they are and we can turn them off.
Well, I think that might be, I bear with me because I'm just sort of having this thought as I'm saying it, but I mean, that might be part of that reason why we fear robots, because they are technology, and we have historically, over the last 10,000 years of human existence, I mean, we have been the ones that create the technology and use it to do our bidding. And so that idea of it saying, nope, I don't want you to boss me around, even if they're not trying to kill us, even if it's not some uprising, but if my Kindle suddenly looked at me and said, no, I'm tired of you reading me now, I'm shutting off. That would be weird, because I am in control of this thing. We have created you for a purpose, and for you to suddenly say no, well, that creates this whole new category of, well, what are you? You're not a tool to make our lives easier anymore. You are now some sort of self-aware thing with your own wishes and desires. And I know we kind of touched on this in our last episode too, but I don't know. It's maybe that's why there's so many of these robot narratives that end up as us versus them, because if anything approaches a level of artificial intelligence, we don't know how to respond to that, because, if the hammer in my toolbox suddenly decided that it wanted to go be a Broadway actor and not a hammer, that would be really weird, because we've created it for a purpose, and it's not to be a Broadway actor.
So who are we to limit its options, really? I mean,
we are its gods. We have created it. We gave it life.
I am ready to see Hammer Hamilton. I'll just put that out there.
Hammer on Broadway.
I mean, you get what I'm saying, right? Like all joking aside, I think, I wonder if that's one of those deep-seated reasons why we get so uncomfortable about the idea of self-aware technology, and especially like so many of the stories of the last, let's say, half of the 20th century and the first part of now the 21st century, so many of these robots stories have been about us fighting robots in some form or another.
Well, we've been talking about how we create robots that look like ourselves, and how robots that start to act like us and not do what they're supposed to do scare us. I've started thinking about the robots that maybe don't really look like us and are coming after us in some way, whether it's almost like a cyborg type thing, or like it's just like technology doesn't even need us anymore in a weird way. And so obviously I think even listeners out there are probably thinking at this point about the Borg. who I think were in like the top 5 best TV villains of all time in one count in 2000 in the like 2013 or 14. And the Borg are kind of the ultimate villain in the Star Trek universe. I think they were introduced on The Next Generation, and I think there was 1 or 2 episodes in Deep Space Nine with the Borg, and then they were a pretty big part of Star Trek Voyager, because if you're familiar with Voyager, you know that the ship gets stuck in the Delta Quadrant, which is super far away from the Federation, and it's going to take them like 70 some odd years to get home, even if they're going to maximum speed. And it turns out they discover that the Delta Quadrant is where the Borg are located, are centered. And so they're constantly running across them to the point where they actually end up with a reformed Borg, I guess you would say, on their ship, trying to teach her about how to be a human. But the Borg, for people who haven't watched Star Trek, are basically kind of cyborgs, though they're probably more on the tech side of cyborgs than the human side. Basically, at some point, technology kind of developed sentience, and they began to create ships that they could fly around the galaxy on. And so they started going around doing what they call assimilating. So they would go to different cultures and at first just take technology. And then they start incorporating humans into that as well, to where you end up with basically a person whose body is used as a framework for all this technology to be coming out of. So instead of an arm, you might have like a drill. You have super strength. They usually have like an ocular implant so they can see different things. And they all have a hive mind. It's a collective. So they all, in their spheres and even over great distances are communicating with each other through getting directives from their queen, almost like a beehive, basically. And then they go out and they assimilate technology and people. So this is where the idea of resistance is futile comes from. The Borg show up. They put you in a tractor beam and they tell you that they're going to assimilate your biological and technological essence for their own purposes. And then they basically board the ship and start assimilating people. In the next gen, they would do it surgically. And in First Contact and Voyager, what they would do is grab people and insert these tubules into your neck and inject you with nanoprobes, which would zip all over your body and turn you into a Borg, like right there, which is definitely more efficient. But this causes all sorts of moral quandaries because, and Matt, I know you've watched Star Trek, so we can talk about this, but one of the things they explore is what it does to people who've been assimilated. So for instance, Picard, the captain in Next Generation, is assimilated and they get him out of it. They get him away from the Borg. And then afterward, every time they come up against the Borg, in First Contact, they almost make it like an Ahab Moby Dick type thing where he's willing to destroy the ship just to kill them. At one point, they find a Borg and he wants to use them as a vehicle for like a disease to kill the Borg, like return him as this like biological weapon. And then you have in Voyager where the captain, reclaims one of the Borg and tries to teach them individuality. And of course, this is also valuing humanity, our idea of what individuality and freedom is, right? Like the Borg think perfection and power is in being a collective, and we think you have to have individual freedom and a personality. And so you have those competing values as well. But I don't know, Matt. I feel like the Borg are probably the most terrifying villains in Star Trek, except for maybe species 8472, who actually cannot be assimilated. Just the scary aspect of them boarding the ship and turning all your friends and colleagues into Borg, who you then have to kill, because they're unreclaimable or whatever, because then they could assimilate you. It's really terrifying. I know we talked about them a little bit with zombies, but that kind of cyborg rampage idea is nightmarish.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that they are so reminiscent of zombies in that regard. And I definitely don't want to just repeat what we said in the zombie episodes we did, I guess back in season 1. But yeah, I mean, there's that whole assimilation thing of, and I believe this was in, excuse me, in First Contact. At one point, one of the decks of the Enterprise gets taken over by the Borg, and essentially somebody says, well, like every one of us that dies is one more of them. Like we can't just stay here. We've got to get out of here. And I mean, that's part of what's so terrifying about zombies, but also I think with the Borg that they have that robot thing too of you can't reason with it. You know, their goal is to create perfect order and perfect perfection, and that involves assimilating every single sentient race that they come across, and that's what they're going to do. And you can say, no, you can't assimilate us, and they'll say, no, we will assimilate you, and then they do it. Like there is no talking them down. There is no arguing with them. I mean, you can fight them, obviously, but you cannot reason with them in the slightest, because they have come up with, by their logic that they internally justify, this is the thing that they should be doing, so they do it. And it's totally terrifying, because I mean, they're also so much more physically stronger than humans as well, because they're so cybernetically augmented.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's also, they also take children, you know, and mature them as Borg, so that all they know is being Borg. So in Voyager, you have the exploration of Seven of Nine's trauma, because she starts... in one episode, she hears something or sees something that reminds her of when she was assimilated as a little child. And it reminds her of the violence of that, you know, watching her parents be assimilated, being taken away, and basically just being Borgified. And it's so horrifying. I mean, on the one hand, it's obviously a battle of different value systems. Like for the Borg, we're just messy and we're almost like a junkyard that needs to be salvaged. So they're going to take us and make us the way we should be, or be perfect. And then to us, it's like, no, I want to keep my individuality. And so you have that kind of warring idea of the communal, the collective versus the individual. But then there's just like the individual trauma of the people who are separated, you know, from their families. And I want to say there's an episode in Voyager where one of the planets actually would, like, when they knew the Borg were in the area, would send up people to be assimilated, like as a distraction, to keep the Borg away from their planet. So like they're safe while other people aren't, but it's because they're like, oh, you, like get in the shuttlecraft and go up, you know, and be assimilated. And so you not only see the conflicts between the Borg and the people they come across, but you also see these horrible things that people do to try to survive when they're faced with that. From, you know, oh, all those people have been assimilated, they're not human anymore, let's blow up this ship or let's shoot them, to let's sacrifice these people so we don't have to be this way anymore. And it's just it's such an interesting exploration, I think, of individuality, like Hugh in Next Gen, where, you know, he is an individual and tries to get other Borg out, but then ends up being swayed by, this is a whole nother discussion, but Data's evil android brother, whatever, Lore, and all the horribleness that comes out of that. But yeah, I don't know. I think the Borg are a really interesting way of playing out this kind of conflicts, and our fear that technology will just, it's not even that the robots will look like us. It's like technology won't even need us anymore. They'll just scavenge us, basically. Like we'll just become parts, you know, for them, and not even have any other, we won't even mean anything to them other than that. Like we have your knowledge and we have your stuff and we have your body, and that's it. That invasion of the body is so terrifying.
Well, but with any luck, they'll just keep us in a people's zoo like the Philip K. Dick android said that he would.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, speaking of like assimilation type things, I think there's another good robot to talk about, and that would be the Cybermen from Doctor Who.
Yeah, the Cybermen are really scary. When I knew that we were doing this episode arc, I rewatched season 2, or series 2, I guess we should call it, since it's a British show, Rise of the Cybermen and Age of Steel, the 2-parter where the Cybermen come up in David Tennant's run. It is really terrifying to see that, and they're very Borg-like. I kind of feel like the Cybermen were the Borg before the Borg existed. But with the Cybermen, you have this huge like cyber factory, or cyber mat as they call it. And it's unclear where exactly they came from, kind of like the Borg. There's this idea that it was a survival technique of some sort for a race on another planet, a planet that was like Earth or near Earth. I'm not sure. It's changed over the course of the 50 some odd years that the show has been on. And listeners, if you're super Doctor Who fans, please don't hold it against me that I don't have a side in that debate, because I know there are competing claims about the Cybermen's origins. But the Cybermen basically, like, it shows like knives and cleavers and everything. I mean, it is a horrible, horrible process to have yourself basically be chopped up, and they take your brain and your nervous system basically and a few other parts of you that they may need and cram you inside this like metal can, and then they all march around together. It's very fascist in a lot of ways. And I'm not sure if they have a collective per se, but they definitely all are communicating with each other and on a mission to, as they call it, upgrade humanity. They talk about how humanity is the past and Cybermen are human 2.0, which is totally using all the language that we use now in the 21st century, like, oh, your phone is out of date, let's upgrade. And the Cybermen are like, why don't you want to be upgraded? And people, of course, are running around screaming. But yeah, this idea of like the Cybermen think that they're better than humans. They're the next step, having no emotion, just being like a brain stuck inside of a can, to them is more powerful. There's more strength in that. And I think the horror of the David Tennant episodes is that he realizes that their emotions are being suppressed, and he defeats them by turning those things off so that they see what they've become and they feel the pain and they know they've been turned into a robot. And the absolute horror of that causes them to explode themselves. Like they don't want to, they can't handle what's happened to them, because you basically would have to be sedated in order to be able to go through that process. And I just found that was so chilling to me, that all these people are undergoing, you think of Doctor Who and it's like campy and kind of silly sometimes, but that is definitely one of those moments in the show where it's just like, wow, it's pretty horrifying. And I think it plays on some of our fears that we may have of technology, like right now. I don't know. I would not want to be upgraded.
No, me either. I definitely don't want to be upgraded. Well, and I feel like that's kind of where that terminology of the upgrading, I mean, that is so similar to the idea of the Borg, because they are also, like, in their eyes, improving these species by giving them the knowledge of every race that they've assimilated. So, I mean, definitely some overlap between those two, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Well, speaking of Doctor Who, should we talk about the Daleks as well? Because I'm kind of on the fence as to whether or not they fit into this, but I guess if the Borg do, then the Daleks have to as well, because they're kind of cybernetic robots, sort of.
Yeah, they have the flesh and blood kind of mutated Dalek inside the can that they use to ride around. They're almost like shop back looking cells. One thing I did want to point out, when I was looking around at stuff about the Borg and the Cybermen earlier today, there is a Star Trek Next Gen Doctor Who mashup comic series. Where Doctor Who and Picard fight a Cybermen Borg unified effort to take over the galaxy. So I have not read this. I didn't know anything about it till today. I am going to try to find it as soon as possible. So, maybe the Borg and the Cybermen have more in common than we thought. But yeah, I mean, the Daleks are basically like a metal shell with something with DNA inside of it. But their story, if I'm remembering correctly from the beginning, comes from two warring races on one planet that basically were using nuclear weapons. And there were a lot of mutations going on. And this one particular scientist, Davros, was playing around with these mutations and trying to make like the perfect example of his race, and he called it a Dalek. And so the idea was that you would take like the best DNA and like create this flesh part that you would then put inside this can, so it would then, I assume, be stronger. I still don't understand how they handle steps. and then they could shoot you. And of course, they hate everything, right? Like they only like what's pure. So they see the whole world around them as almost like mongrels, and they're all about exterminate, exterminate, exterminate. Again, that almost like fascist mentality. And over the course of Doctor Who, you have all these like break off societies of Daleks who think that they're purer than the others, or they're trying to experiment. I think one Dalek even tried to become a human Dalek hybrid. But that idea of like being the same and thinking that that's better than what we like to think of as, the freedom and individuality that we have. Yeah, Daleks are pretty scary, though. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the Cybermen might be a little bit scarier than the Daleks. I don't know. It's kind of a toss-up.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how it is you want to die. Do you want to be disintegrated and murdered, or do you want to be upgraded? I don't know.
I think of the two, I would rather be disintegrated than upgraded.
It does seem a lot quicker and hopefully less painful, but...
Well, it doesn't quite have the existential horror that the Cybermen apparently carry with them.
Right. I was just going to ask you guys, I was thinking today about how the idea of upgrade, like, haha, but, now we have like Google glasses, right? I mean, I don't think we're that far away from a world where we could have, like the Luke Skywalker hand or an ocular implant that makes you see different things that we can't normally see, or maybe something to like enhance your hearing, and I don't know. I mean, maybe the Borg and the Cybermen are like a warning against doing that too much. I mean, how much of enhancing ourselves with technology is too much? You know what I mean?
I feel like if y'all haven't read Benjamin Percy's The Dark Net, that would answer all the questions.
Would I be able to sleep at night?
No, not at all. And I think you definitely would not want enhancements after. I'll just throw that out there as a little plug, but...
Noted. Well,
I think that's another problem with robots, though, is that idea of enhancement. Like, when does technology that we're using to improve ourselves become too much?
Right. Well, and there's that question, too, of not just how much is too much, but at what point are you no longer human? If you start out by replacing your hand with a robot hand, okay, then you're just a human with a robot hand. But let's say then you move on to your arm, and then your other arm, and then your legs, and then your torso, and then your head. So all that is just your original brain in this robotic body. Okay, that's fine. Well, then what happens if you find some way to take your consciousness and put it onto silicone chips and put that into the robot body so it's not even a brain anymore? It's still your consciousness, but are you now a robot that's conscious, or are you a human?
And then what do you classify as consciousness? Like, is it memories? Is it personality? Is it, sense of morality? Like, what constitutes consciousness then?
Oh, exactly. I mean, these are those deep sort of philosophical questions that I don't know that. Well, I mean, I'm sure that they've come up amongst people who are already talking about, cybernetic implants and that sort of thing. And like you said, Mel, it's if it ever does happen, it's a long way away. But I think it's a good question to ask because, I mean, it does kind of get to the heart of what is it that makes us human. And like you said, Lisa, what is it that makes us conscious? Is it self-awareness or memories, like you said, or I don't know. I don't think there is an answer for how much is too much. That's for sure.
And if that is programmed into you, because we've certainly seen text where like memories, for instance, are programmed in. Once you have that, if it's programmed in, does it still count? If we take that consciousness, whatever we define it as, but it's just a copy of your conscience that you're programming into something else, then does it still belong to you? Is it still you, or is it a new you, or is it something else entirely? That's just a very uncomfortable place to live, I think.
Definitely.
That makes my brain hurt, and it's a little bit late at night for that.
Well, I mean, what if we did figure out what consciousness was and download to something? Then, like, what would make me if it was in a robot? It wouldn't grow anymore, right? Like, it would stay me at that moment, I would think. I mean, it seems
you
more
program
like
it to grow.
Well, that's true. But then is it really me? It almost seems more like a ghost me in that case, or like a copy, like you were saying. I don't know. I think we talked about this with Electric Grandmother, where I was basically arguing that people must die. And I feel like human beings have to have an end. I mean, I don't know that immortality through a consciousness recorded into something else. And what does that really do? And also, how would you keep updating when it was saved? Wouldn't it be great if we all saved our consciousnesses so we could be like immortal, but then the tech was like outdated in 5 years and you lost it all? I mean, you would never be able to hold everything forever.
Matt, I'm a little afraid of Mel at this moment.
Yeah. I think this is the beginning of like some sort of experiment that she's going to perform.
No, Mel, but you're absolutely right, because I think what you've hit at, and we've kind of been talking about this, is that, there is some inherent difference between robots and humans. Like, we can make our robots look as close to humanity as we can, but there's always going to be something, that indefinable something that doesn't make them human. Whether it's the fact that they don't have a limited lifespan that kind of colors their memories and colors how they see the world, or whether it's this idea of like ethics or morality, or I don't know, we've thrown around the term self-awareness. But then I even kind of question that, or the ability to grow and think and develop new ideas that aren't programmed in. I don't know what the defining spaces between robot and human, but there is something there. And there's also something to be said about technology, because we know that technology goes out of date and that there are issues with even the most advanced technologies that we see. One thing that I thought of immediately is, as you guys were talking about, we throw around the term artificial intelligence all the time. And really, artificial intelligence, as we understand it, is, almost kind of akin to like predictive text we have on our phone, where it's just getting a bunch of data and trying to understand it and guess what data will be used next. And there's this company on the internet, you can look them up now, called Botnik Studios. Have you guys looked this up at all?
No.
It's Botnik, Botnik, and they have done basically an artificial intelligence experiment, I guess would be the right word for it, but it's kind of using predictive text, where they fed it all the Harry Potter books and had it write a new Harry Potter book. And it did it. It wrote a new Harry Potter book, but it is terrifying because it will sound like a Harry Potter book, and it has the kind of cadence of a Harry Potter book and the same characters and settings and all that, but then it will have something bizarre like, and then Ron turned into spiders. Or it has Hermione yelling something bizarre. So you kind of see how there's a limit to things like this, because we can make it sound right and look right, but there's just something there that isn't right. And I know we're kind of getting to the end of this, and there's no way we're going to be able to discuss all of our favorite robots, but I did kind of want to give a little shout out to Black Mirror, because they've done a lot with this kind of technology in that show. And one episode in particular really stuck out to me when we're talking about how technology can't quite fulfill being totally human. And it's the first episode of the second season. So I won't go into too many details with this, because I don't want to spoil it if you haven't seen it yet. And Black Mirror is one of those shows that you really kind of need to absorb totally as you're watching it. But I will say this, that this episode is called Be Right Back. Like I said, it's the first episode of the second season, and it deals with a technology that has been invented to basically replace humans that we've lost. So if you've lost a loved one, it's technology that's kind of meant to fill that void. And it touches on a lot of the things we've been talking about over this episode and over this entire series. And I'll just throw it out there too that it stars Donald Gleason. So if you're at all a fan of like the newest Star Wars movies or anything that he's been in, he's fantastic. So I highly recommend going and finding that. I think it's still on Netflix. It's the same. I think it's the same season that had White Bear, which I know a lot of people talked about. But anyway, I highly recommend going and looking at that. And like I said, it explores how technology can come really close to what we want it to do, but it's just automatically destined to fail just because of what it is.
Well, Lisa, that's a great point. But like you said, we just don't have enough time to talk about all of our favorite robots and androids, and we're actually rapidly approaching the end of this episode. So that's probably a good place for us to go ahead and wrap it up. Now, before we go, I do want to remind everybody that if you're interested in helping support this podcast, you can visit us at patreon.com/nofearcast to help support us financially. But there's no pressure to do that. If you want to help out this podcast for free, then just tell a friend about us or like us or rate us on iTunes. That's how other people help discover our show. So once again, thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.